For the third time in the history of humanity, civilization is undergoing social phase change. The first time was during the Agricultural Revolution, the second time during the Industrial Revolution, and we're now in the midst of an autonomous revolution. Social phase change. Everybody who's listening to me is familiar with phase change. You've seen clouds turn into snowflakes. It's the same water molecule, just a different form. When water goes through a critical temperature, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it changes form. It goes from being a liquid to a solid. It obeys different rules, fluid flow for water. It uses different tools. Pumps and pipes work very well with water. And our intuition about water tells us absolutely nothing about ice. This analogy also comes with a warning. Ice breaks pipes and it sinks ships. Remember the Titanic. If you do not deal with phase change correctly, you're bound to have problems. Civilizations experience something very similar to physical phase change. Their institutions, when they reach critical points, change form, obey different rules, use different tools, and our intuition about the new forms often fails us, and they have difficulty making the adjustment. To make this a little bit more concrete, I'd like to give you an interesting example. Bank robbery. In recent years, it's undergone phase change. Think about it. In the early 1900s, Willie Sutton used to rob banks. When asked why, he said, because that's where the money is. Sutton completed 100 successful robberies and stole on the order of $2 million. $20,000 a robbery. That's equivalent to $300,000 today. Today, the average bank robber, using Sutton's tools, escape cars and guns, gets on the order of $5,000. It was definitely time for a phase change in bank robbery. The intuition of financial institutions failed them. They put a lot of insecure financial information on the internet. It took no time at all for an organization that went by the name of Citadel to catch on. They used 1,200 botnets to install Zeus spyware on about 1 million consumer computers, and the form of bank robbery changed. What happened was it made sense to steal small amounts of money from individual bank accounts as a way of stealing from the bank. Citadel did this very well. They stole $500 million and operated in places that did not really consider cybercrime to be a serious problem. Essentially, no one was punished in the whole operation. Phase change in the social world is not driven by endo and exothermatic reactions. It's driven by equivalences. In the Agricultural Revolution, there was a food equivalence. In the Industrial Revolution, we substituted machine power for the power of animals and the power of human beings. The autonomous civilization is going to be driven by three equivalences. The first of them is pretty easy to guess. It's an intelligence equivalence. We're going to use intelligent machines and smart robots to replace intelligent people. The second is the spatial equivalence. Lots of things that we do in physical space, we're going to be doing in virtual space. For example, we're shopping at Amazon and socializing on Facebook. We're substituting things we used to do in physical space for things we can now do in virtual space. The third equivalence is something we call an information equivalence. A lot of the things that exist in our society are just information proxies in disguise. A bank is really just an information processing application that probably will become an app on your smartphone. Think of an office building. It's got a parking lot with automobiles. Inside the building, there are offices and people sitting at desks, and there are information networks. We send around pieces of paper and we talk to one another, and we use computer networks. And we have all kinds of information storage devices. We have paper files. We've got things resident in people's minds. And we also have big data files that are of electronic nature. And then we have voice recognition systems and voice response systems. We use people to do that when they answer and talk on the phone. The information equivalent of that is a few racks of electronics with a little AI software, a speech synthesizer, and some speech recognition hardware. And pretty soon, a few thousand employees in a call center occupying hundreds of thousands of square feet can be replaced by a few racks of electronics. Well, the autonomous revolution is going to take us a step closer to utopia. After all, we've got skyrocketing productivity. We've got knowledge at our fingertips, which is going to stimulate the rate of innovation. We've got new and great experiences in virtual worlds, and we are living in a world of material abundance. I know we are going to face difficulties in adjusting, but the thing that makes me so hopeful is that we figured out how to deal with this during the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, and we were doing it at a time of scarcity. We ought to be creative enough to figure out how to do this at a time of material abundance. But there are several things that are going to be different about this time, and I'd like to discuss three of them with you. The first one is the nature of our new technologies. In the past, our general purpose technologies were technologies of displacement, they were technologies of efficiency, and they had big, big creation effects. The technologies of the future are efficiency technologies and displacement technologies, but they have much smaller creation effects. I'd like to give you probably the best example and the prime example of all of this. Think about the internal combustion engine. Well, it made the tractor possible, so we needed a lot fewer people working on the farm. But it also created the automobile, and the automobile replaced a lot of horses. And 27% of the farmland in the United States was devoted to raising feed for horses. We didn't need that anymore. And then if you looked at Manhattan or New York, you'd have found that there were 427 blacksmiths, 249 carriage makers. We didn't need those people anymore either. And so by 1910, there were a lot of people who used to depend upon the horse for their income in one way or another, take care of them in stables. They no longer had jobs. I know what we all think of. We think of that big Rouge factory that the Ford Motor Company created, where people streamed through the gates. And we think of the automobile industry employing a lot of people. But a lot more happened than that. The automobile created a need for steel. When it created a need for steel, we needed to mine iron ore in Minnesota, and we created the great industrial cities of Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh. We needed also other commodities like rubber and glass. And then automobile had a very strange habit. It didn't run on hay, so we created the oil industry. And then suddenly, automobiles had that nasty habit of breaking down and being difficult to repair. And so we created automotive services. And soon we found that driving an automobile at 30 or 40 miles an hour on a dirt road wasn't really a lot of fun. So we started building highways. And once we built those highways, we could travel even faster, and people could move out of cities and live rather than in dirty and unhealthy cities and clean suburbs. So we did suburban construction. And if you had looked at the world in 1970, a tremendous amount of it was either directly or indirectly a rate of the internal combustion engine and the changes that it drove in society. Take a look at what goes on with our new technologies. Amazon replaces physical stores, but it doesn't really increase retail sales. Or think about the iPod that started the displacement of the media business. CD sales fell almost in half from 27 billion to 15 billion very, very quickly. The distribution systems that supported those things, like the Virgin megastores and Tower Records, went out of business. Tower Records declared bankruptcy. And I think we all remember recorded media and how we used to go to one of those 9,000 Blockbuster stores that employed 60,000 people to pick up a videotape to watch at home. And then we didn't need DVD and CD players, so that went away. And in the final indignity of it all, the iPhone replaced the iPod, which started it all. Well, we've had some creation effects. We have Spotify, which has taken the place of a lot of the music distribution that or the physical distribution we have. We have Netflix. But think about this. When Netflix drove Blockbuster out of business, Blockbuster, with 9,000 physical stores and all the people that were involved in maintaining those stores and the space it occupied and their 60,000 employees, got replaced by 1,000 Netflix employees. This effect, this displacement effect, is going to make jobs more scarce. It's also going to create a great deal of wealth inequality. The second thing that is happening is something very strange is going on with productivity. All productivity is not created equal. And we really have two kinds of productivity. Something I call monetizable productivity, or we call monetizable productivity, which is the productivity we know and love. And something else called non-monetizable productivity, which has been around for a long time, but right now it is proliferating at a great rate. The productivity we like, monetizable productivity, Robert Gordon wrote about in his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. Gordon pointed out that between 1920 and 1970, productivity grew at the rate of 2.8% a year, but something wonderful happened to GNP. Gross national product increased at 3.2% a year. When GNP grows faster than productivity, it creates jobs, it causes wages to go up, and it redistributes wealth. Today's tools are driving massive growth in productivity, and a lot of it is what I call non-monetizable productivity. Well, I first learned about non-monetizable productivity from Bob Noyce in the 1970s. One day, Bob, who was the inventor of the integrated circuit and one of the founders of Intel, walked into my office and he was really frustrated. And I said, "Bob, what's bugging you?" And he said to me, "I've just gotten back from a meeting with financial analysts and they were all over me because the productivity of Intel employees from their point of view wasn't increasing. What they were saying was that the dollar output per Intel employee was not going up." And he said, I just got so frustrated and I lectured him and I said, we've got the most productive employees in the world. They're producing 40% more transistors per head per year. The problem isn't with the productivity of our employees. The problem is with the fact that the price per transistor is falling so fast. That is an example of non-monetizable productivity. and it's around us everywhere today. Think of the newspaper. Print media advertising fell from 46 billion to 22 billion in a little over a decade. There were 450,000 newspaper employees. Today, there are 250,000. And I'll bet every one of us gets all of the news we want. We get it faster, it's better, it comes with video, and it comes with links. Non-monetizable productivity creates deflationary pressures, and it slows wage growth. In the past, all of our problems, all of our economic problems, I'm exaggerating, according to neoclassical economists, could be solved by raising productivity. When we raise non-monetizable productivity, things don't work that way anymore. We have to think differently about productivity. Finally, we're facing something that I call the bipolar economy. In the past, the economy was more homogeneous. When prices went up, wages went up. Things were more closely correlated. But today, something else is happening. In the bipolar economy, wages are being set by the price that a robot will charge for doing the same job. The value of work for many people is going down. But something else is happening. The typical middle-class family spends 80% of their money on the necessities of life. In recent years, maybe not just this past year with all the problems we're having with COVID, the price of homes was doubling it was going up at twice the rate of inflation. Healthcare costs increased at 54% over the past 5 years. That's at about 4 or 5 times the rate of inflation. And then, of course, the costs of education and food have also been going up at a rate that is faster than inflation. The typical middle-class worker is working and earning a living in a deflationary economy and trying to feed his kids and take care of his family and educate his children in an inflationary one. I think it's easy to understand the rise of populism. Now, there are lots of issues that we're going to face in the autonomous economy of the future. For example, there are going to be lots of different business structures. Some businesses will just become smartphone applications. I suspect that most banks are going to be that way. In Sweden, 90% of the banks don't even handle cash anymore. So things are definitely trending in that way. I think we're going to have a shortage of jobs. There are all kinds of issues with free speech and fake news. And then there are the issues of privacy. You literally can't have freedom without privacy. I'm going to talk about 2 of those issues, and Mike may want to make some comments on the other ones as well. But I'd like to talk to you about the job. It is hard to believe that just 300 years ago, the job was considered drudgery, and utopia was someplace where people didn't have to work. Today, utopia is a place where you've got a good job and benefits and good retirement plans and things like that. So the world has changed. Maybe we're going to have to think a little differently about what our definition is of utopia in the future. There are lots of studies out there. McKinsey did a report a few years ago that estimated by 2025, 400 to 800 million jobs worldwide would be displaced by technology. Now that's a wide range, but it's also a lot of jobs. But there are lots of other studies that indicate that jobs are going to be in short supply. And jobs, our whole market-based economy, has been based on jobs. They are the source of the access to wealth. They are the way and the engine. They were the engine for wealth redistribution. And they are the way that many people seek and identify and serve to bolster their self-esteem. I suspect in the future there will not be enough jobs. Now, I hope that the free market can solve the problem, but I'm not very optimistic about it. For example, there are lots of things we can do with job training, and we know that there are many high-tech jobs that are unfilled, so that will help. And certainly less regulation and lower taxes, those are good things to do. And bringing back manufacturing jobs from overseas, that's a good thing to do. But I'd like to point out to you about bringing manufacturing jobs back. 80% of us work in services. Those are the industries that are being affected and where productivity is increasing massively because of all of our wonderful AI tools. A 1% improvement in productivity and services, getting rid of 1% of the employees, as an example, would require for us to grow jobs by 6% in manufacturing. It's hard to see how the growth in manufacturing jobs are going to offset the growth in productivity driven by our AI and other robotic tools. Now, I'm hopeful about one area that we don't talk enough about, and that's construction. Some of us have heard about the $3.6 trillion backlog we've got in this country. We need to fix roads and repair bridges and fix our sewage systems and things like that. But that is a really small construction project. What I'd like to point out to you is that every time phase change has occurred, we have ended up rebuilding the social and physical infrastructure of our society. Just remember what happened with the automobile. Well, in the future, I think we're going to discover a lot of things are going to have to be rebuilt. For example, in the past, we built the highways and that created the suburbs. I suspect in the future, as we are already seeing, the automobile is going to become obsolete in a lot of metropolitan areas. Just dealing with the traffic is overwhelming. So I think we're going to need a lot more public transportation. But when you build public transportation, you want to have housing along the public transportation routes. So that may lead to building apartment buildings in a different place. And then we've got a lot of repurposing to do. We don't need as much retail space. And if anything, the COVID pandemic should have convinced us of, is a lot of us are going to be able to figure out how to work from home. And so we probably are not going to need as much office space in the future. And I keep coming back to the vision that Jane Jacobs outlined in a great book that she wrote in the 1960s, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jacobs envisioned cities that people wanted to live in, that were walking cities with a lot more green space. And I think that we may end up creating cities that are much more livable and adjusted to the way people would like to live. Well, I'd like to point out that today, construction accounts for around 5% of our GNP. During the Eisenhower administration, when we were building the highways, it accounted for 10% of our GNP. So maybe construction will be the growth industry, the job growth industry of the information age. But I suspect that we are still going to have to do more than that. Many of the jobs we're creating are low-wage jobs. So I suspect that we're going to be faced with doing some earned income credits. And then much of the work people do today is socially useful work, but has no monetary value. Think about it. We're saying, hey, people have to go back to work so they can have to be able to put their kids in childcare. Maybe in the future, we should think about paying people for doing socially useful work like raising kids. And that would be a revolutionary and very difficult thing to do. But I think it's something that we may end up considering that we should do. And then I think we probably are going to end up with a universal basic income. I have for years felt very uncomfortable with that proposal. But then I read the idea of Charles Murray, an economic conservative. And Murray's idea was to pay every American below a certain wage level over the age of 18, $13,000 a year, $3,000 of which would be used for health insurance. And the remaining 10,000 could be spent on anything that anybody wanted to spend it on. Murray would help finance this by getting rid of all other entitlements. So you'd get rid of the entitlement infrastructure and people could spend the money any way they wanted. Well, that sounded like a pretty interesting proposal to me. Finally, I'd like to say something about free speech. We have lived in this country with the illusion of free speech for a couple hundred years. But in reality, it was like yelling from a mountaintop. You could say whatever you wanted, but nobody was around to listen to you. If you wanted to talk to the masses, one-to-many communication, the free market set the rules. You either had to go through mass media where you were edited, or you had to have a lot of money, like George Soros with his $18 billion Open Society Foundation, or the Koch brothers who spent $400 million to influence the 2018 congressional election. The free market controlled free speech. Suddenly, the cost of one-to-many communications dropped to zero. And when it did, we created a productivity tool for socially destructive behavior. In one simple example, email is costing businesses around $250 billion a year in lost employee time and dealing with spam. Cybercrime leverages cheap email and is now costing the world around $800 billion a year. They use it to launch phishing attacks. Cheap ways of communication have fostered polarization and election interference. I think we should look at making free speech expensive again. And the place I would start would be a simple one. I'd just start charging for email. The beauty of that is you could start charging a penny for each email recipient. And if that didn't work, raise the price to a nickel. And you could dial right in and do things like that. We should also look possibly at making the internet more expensive as well. While I am optimistic that we're going to be able to deal with all these challenges, we're going to have to think differently. We're going to have to apply new rules, and we're going to have to come up with new tools. But if we do, we can turn what sometimes looks like the dark clouds of phase change into beautiful white snowflakes, and we can take a step closer to utopia. Thank you.
I'd like to amplify on a few things that you talked about. The first one has to do with social phase change. I think the critical message there is that when you have a social phase change, and they're very rare in the 20,000 year history of mankind, at least since writing, we've only had two. And when we read now the futurists saying, oh, we're entering into a fourth industrial revolution, I don't think that goes far enough. I mean, that's what Bill and I have been writing, that No, this is bigger than that. This is the equivalent of that sheep herder out there in the Levant coming over a hill and seeing the city of Jericho for the first time. And just as in a physical phase change, in a cultural phase change, a social phase change, all the rules change. None of the tools you have can tell you what you're looking at. If you were to wander in off those grasslands into Jericho, you would have no idea what you were looking at. You wouldn't even know human beings lived there until you actually saw one. From a distance, you wouldn't be able to tell. There's a story about Jengas Khan invading China, and the hordes ran down the main street of Beijing, and there was gold in the stores and silks and everything else. And they just grabbed animals and basic items because they had no idea that these other things of the future represented wealth. And so each time we go into a phase change, you can read it in Dickens, and you can read it, you know, in Gilgamesh, which is the story of the first phase change, that we think that we're seeing something evolving, but in fact, it's transforming utterly. So we think we look ahead and we think we can predict the next few years. But in fact, our understanding is inadequate for what's about to happen to us, we think. That our measurement tools are wrong. And if we imagine that we're not going to change, we're fooling ourselves, that we are going to fundamentally change. The difference between that young kid working on the farm in 1710 and the kid working in the factory 60 years later was profound. It was a different sense of time and space and their role in the universe and God and government and everything else. So we have to prepare ourselves for this enormous change that's coming. Now, the second thing Bill was talking about was the bipolar economy. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit too. As he said, the real world, the natural world, is inflationary. The things that we do to survive, shelter, food, all of those things, increasingly inflationary because there's scarcity. Conversely, the cyber world is deflationary. It gives us more and more stuff for less every year, and is creating a tension that's pulling our economy and our society in two different directions. And which one do we prefer to be pulled to? Well, the one that gets cheaper and gives us more stuff every year. More and more, we're moving into cyberspace for greater parts of our lives. And if you look at kids during this quarantine, they are looking at screens and displays all day long. They're living in TikTok and Instagram and instant messaging and everything else. But we've evolved to succeed in the natural world. The natural world wasn't designed for us. Trees don't grow to make us paper. We figured out how to turn trees into paper, but those trees weren't there for 100 million years for that purpose. The cyber world is a whole different matter. It was designed specifically to capture our attention and to monetize it. We have not evolved for this world. It will take us thousands of years, perhaps. So it's already beginning to rewire children's brains, according to a lot of brain research out there. So that's a world designed to manipulate us that we're not wholly prepared for. And as it begins to take up 40% of our time, 50% of their time, I'm hearing numbers for kids, 60% of their time. This becomes a major force in our lives that we're not truly prepared for. And what we're experiencing there has been carefully designed to manipulate our attention, control our actions, keep us engaged with quick endorphin, peaks, playing video games or gambling or whatever we do to keep us engaged. And we don't know the effects of that. So that's something we have to worry about as well. Now, in terms of jobs, Bill and I wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review a while back, which is preliminary to doing this book, where we wrote about ZEVs, Z-E-V. ZEVs are zero economic value citizens. And years ago, we thought, well, you know, automation will come along, robotics, and we won't need guys welding quarter panels on the front of F-150 pickups. You know, we'll have a robot do that. And it's too bad these low-level blue-collar jobs, ditch diggers, that sort of thing, will be replaced by robots and automation, but we'll retrain them. Well, now we look around and we realize that automation has come to us. AI is now transforming our lives, that radiologists are getting replaced all over the world. I'm a fourth generation newspaper man. And nowadays, the average newspaper you read is about 1/3 written by AI. All those sales and earning announcements and all the boilerplate and aggregate and all that is no longer done by human beings. Our jobs are all going away. So how many will go away? Well, I mean, you heard Bill's statement about international job losses. One report has the total number of US jobs that will disappear is at 47% within the next 10 years. So these people are not only going to be unemployed, but they're going to become ZEVs in the sense that they will not be employable. You can't retrain them for anything else because that's going to be replaced. They become unemployable for the rest of their lives. Is it their fault? Hard to blame them for a world that's changing this fast, and it's taking doctors' jobs, and it's going to take bankers' jobs, and the most educated people in the country, some of them are going to find their jobs disappear. So Bill's asking the question, how do we find them jobs? Let me ask the question, what is the moral dimension of a life in which you don't have work? You can get paid a check. It won't be enough for you to, you know, be upwardly mobile, but you'll live a pretty happy life because this deflation and Mohr's law is going to all sorts of experiences. But you're sitting in that studio apartment and you got a wall-sized TV for free, and you can rent a drone cheap and fly over the Eiffel Tower, simulating a rich life of travel. If your food's being delivered to your door, how do you make your life is complete by modern standards, but is your life full? Is your life going to be sufficiently rewarding for you to feel like, I've had a happy life, I've had a productive life, I've given back to mankind, my life has meaning? How do we invest meaning into this new world that's emerging towards us? And I don't think we have an answer to that yet. We don't even know how yet to formulate the answers because we don't know what the rules are going to be. Now, Bill talked about service jobs disappearing, but also the fact that we have millions of service duties in this country that aren't being recognized as jobs. Now, for the last 20 years, hell, I even wrote a book about it, about intellectual capital, the idea of being able to audit intangible assets and reward people for the contributions that don't show up on the balance sheet. I think that's a distinct possibility there, but every attempt to develop some sort of market, some sort of audit for a reporting system for intangible assets has failed. So we don't have the tools yet even to figure out how to solve the problem. So all of that's pretty terrifying stuff. The good news is Bill used the word utopia. I'm not sure this is going to get us to utopia, but every time we've had a social phase change, mankind has gone through tremendous amounts of strife during the transition, but has come out on the other side much, much better off. All you have to do is look at the tables of lifespan throughout human history. It didn't change until suddenly in 1750, it leapt and went right through the roof. You know, the average lifespan was about 45 in 1730. In 1790, it was all of a sudden in the 50s, and now it's pushing being in the 80s. Why did that happen? Because of the Industrial Revolution, because of new pharmaceuticals, new healthcare, new ways of living, safer systems. We ended up infinitely better. My sense is that we are going through that period of strife right now. I think we can look out the window, we can watch cable news and see that this transformation that Bill and I predicted would be a few years off is already starting to hit us. And it's going to be tough, but my sense is on the far side, we will come up with something unbelievably rewarding. That utopia that Bill talked about, the idea that we can live a lot longer, our lives become easier. Somehow we find a way to make life more fulfilling and moral and ethical. I think that's all out there. We just have to find the right tools. We have to be looking for them. And it's coming on fast. The coronavirus quarantine has already begun to produce massive changes that we can't yet predict. I mean, look at us right now. We're doing a Zoom speech. I've never done a Zoom speech in my life until about a month and a half ago. People, do we want to live in cities now that we see this is where pandemics emerge and have their worst effects? People are streaming out of the cities. Violence is increasing. It's doubled in a matter of months. Where do we go? How do we now live? We're going to have to move very, very quickly. Opportunities. I've been working with a woman writing a book, and she's identified $20 trillion new markets that are emerging. And one of the most obvious ones, which should be of great interest to you folks, is mobile medical. Nobody wants to go to the doctor anymore. Nobody wants to go and wait in a waiting room. They want to transmit their data from home, but it's got to be secure. It's got to be accurate, which the current systems you see on TV aren't. And it has to be understandable and translatable. We have all the tools for that. New products are emerging, but we have to learn how to assimilate them into our society. That's the next big platform that eventually will merge with existing platforms, but it's a gigantic opportunity that will save millions of lives and make our lives once again a little better. So the bad news is we're going to go through some scary stuff and a lot of changes. We will not emerge the same people that went in. And we will not even be able to truly remember what we're living through right now when that day comes. But the opportunities are infinite. And the best times are yet to come.